What I'll try and do is that I'm going to kind of just rush through a bit of the shut down the business school stuff, but expanding some elements of it in order to talk about what I think are the kind of the key issues facing the study of organizations right now. Um, but just before that, because you kind of asked me to do a bit of this, and given the various different disciplinary backgrounds that people come from, let me say a little bit about critical management studies, and consequently also a little bit about me. Um, my background is in sociology and anthropology and cultural studies, and like quite a lot of people in the UK, we were drawn into the expanding business school in the 1990s. So lots of us with PhDs in various kind of social science and humanities disciplines ended up working in the business school because that's where the jobs were. Um, and one of the things I think that happened effectively was that the a lot of the kind of critical perspectives that were being used in sociology and anthropology and geography and politics and various other places were consequently drawn into the business school at that point. So for myself, for example, I was particularly interested in, say, critical theory or various sociological theories of organization. And so I used those ideas in order to make sense of what was going on in terms of teaching and research within the business school. Now, that's not an uncommon story right the way across Northwestern Europe, um, in the sense that effectively what we see is business schools in Northwestern Europe expanding from something like the 1980s, 1990s onwards, but really just not having the staff. So effectively, they had to pull in staff from, as I've said, social sciences and humanities. And I think that kind of really kick-started this thing, which we now call critical management studies, which is effectively a kind of an internal, an imminent critique of the business school, practiced by many of the people who now occupy sometimes quite senior positions within these schools, but often have ideological and theoretical positions which are quite opposed to conventional business school education. So critical management studies, in a sense, over the last really almost 30 years now, has been a small but noisy form of internal opposition within many of the business schools of Northwest Europe, particularly the UK and Scandinavia. But also you see examples of it in France, some in Spain, a couple of people I know in Portugal, but it's a kind of Northern European phenomenon primarily, I think it's fair to say. Um, the other thing I guess it's worth saying about it is that despite the fact that it's been noisy, it hasn't been particularly effective in terms of altering the trajectories of Northern European business schools. Um, so my sense has been that we've been very noisy, but been rather tolerated, if you like. The very fact, I've often used this as an example, the very fact that I could write a book called Shut Down the Business School the same year as I was given a job at the University of Bristol demonstrates just how futile these forms of critique are. Because if the critique really mattered, then they wouldn't have appointed me in the first place. Yeah. So, my point is really the critical management studies people have written a lot, but it hasn't made a lot of difference. It hasn't affected the way that business schools operate. Yeah. So that's a kind of general sort of context thing. What I'll do now is spin fairly quickly through some of the shut down the business school kind of arguments, because that'll help me provide a sort of a story for then expanding out on some of what I think are the kind of contemporary challenges for thinking about organizing, and particularly in the context of thinking about forms of alternative organizing that I assume are going to be necessarily connected to questions of degrowth, decarbonisation, social justice, just transition, etc. All those kinds of words. Yeah. So let me share a presentation. Just bear with me a second. That one. Okay, can you see this? Just someone tell me if they can see it. Hello?
Yeah, we can see it.
You can see it.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, that's great. See if I can get it to. Okay, so is that all right? I'll assume I'm okay.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, that's great. I can't see you lot now, so you need to speak rather than wave at me. Okay, so this talk, shut down the business schools. It's sort of in two moves, really. So the first bit is the critique, the shut down the business schools bit. The second part is the towards a school for organisation bit, and that's the more kind of positive bit. The school for organisation is essentially my attempt to reframe the way in which we should teach about organising. So it's that opens onto ideas about new perspectives and so on. Okay, so I think it's important to say that popular critique of the business school is very, very common. You know, it's not the preserve of critical management studies. This is an example from the Matt Groening show Futurama, where Gunter, who's a moderately intelligent monkey, decides at the end of the show that all he wants to be is a moderately intelligent monkey in a suit, so he goes to get an MBA. And those ideas about the sort of the popular understandings of what business schools do, I think are quite important, because generally most people who have nothing to do with business education tend to think that business schools are places that produce greed and selfishness. They're essentially places in which shallow and narrow people go to learn how to screw over other people. And there's an enormous amount of kind of popular research, if you like, that suggests that business schools encourage people to be immoral, to be selfish, to be egoistic, and so on. In other bits of work I've done, I've tried to look at this in terms of sort of, if you like, representations of managers more generally. And I think it's fair to say that in popular culture, managers are almost universally portrayed to be negative figures, either to be at the center of various kinds of conspiracies or to be figures of fun of some kind. Yeah, just sort of laughable figures. Now, it's important to say that, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think that means that in order to change the way that we think about organizing, in a sense, what we need to do is to forget about some of the very academic ways of presenting this stuff and get back to more kind of popular understandings of what it might mean to organize. The history of business schools is really an European one, not a Northern European one. No, sorry, not a North American one. Most of the early business schools were founded in Northwest Europe, and they're essentially places where where the emerging technocrats, if you like, of the capitalist class were being taught. Many of these schools are effectively accountancy schools. They're kind of teaching double entry bookkeeping, but they're quite often also associated with things like chambers of commerce in certain cities in Northwest Europe. So they're kind of becoming, it's almost like a class becoming a class for itself in a sense. These schools, and this is only a partial list, have almost entirely been forgotten in terms of their curriculum innovation and the way in which they were starting to build an idea about what teaching and research in business might look like. And they've been forgotten largely because of the Americans. So the first American school is usually suggested to be Wharton in the 1870s, but effectively what you see then from about the 1870s to the 1930s as it is an enormous series of big American universities founding big schools. And many of these schools, of course, become really kind of gold standard places, particularly somewhere like Harvard, which effectively is now very often treated as the apex of business school research and education. You know, this is the business school that everybody else wants to admire. It's important to note, however, that this history isn't in itself uncomplicated, because many of those schools, many of these American schools, particularly as we get towards the kind of the Gilded Age of the turn of the century, are also kind of dealing with a certain sort of ethical or political problem that the concentration of industry has given them. So Remember, we're speaking at a time when effectively, you know, the US is regarded as being run by robber barons of gigantic concentrations of wealth and power and influence, and popularly understood to be, you know, to be running the White House. It's effectively what it's what the business leaders think that gets done, not what the politicians and so on. So it's kind of necessary for these schools to also talk about a certain kind of moral mission too. The idea that what they're doing is producing a kind of an ethical code for managers, producing a set of ideas which allow managers to become respectable leaders, not merely, not only, you know, wealthy cowboys who screw everybody else over. So what do business schools actually do then? The business school market is now absolutely gigantic. These are figures from probably 10 years ago now, where the AACSB guesses that there is about 13,000 business schools in the world. I haven't found any more recent estimates, but I think we can assume that, you know, that figure is growing. When I did the sums on this a few years ago, that means that the tuition fee income from business schools, tuition fee alone, is about $400 billion. And if you add to that all the variety of ancillary services, you know, the production of textbooks and consulting and all the rest of, you know, all the stuff that goes around with business schools, we're talking about a gigantic chunk of higher education. When you look at the participation figures now, in the UK, something like 1 in 7 students is studying some variant of business education, business accounting, marketing, whatever. Globally, and the figures are a bit unclear because it's not always obvious the basis on which they're being collected, but the UNESCO figures suggest that globally business school higher education accounts for something like between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 of students. So this is a huge concentration of knowledge. Yeah, 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 higher education students globally studying some variant of business. I don't think that since the, you know, since the concentrations of theological knowledge in the Middle Ages that we've seen such a subject dominance, which effectively, you know, I will describe as a form of ideological takeover, but we'll get to that in a bit. So what do business schools actually do? This is London Business School, you know, one of the global elite, looking out over the over Regent's Park in northwest London. The London Business School sells itself in a fairly similar way that most other business schools do, which is mostly an appeal to the individual rather than any vague idea about collective advancement. It's a way of suggesting that individuals, if they invest in the substantial fees that London Business School and other places ask for, that this will benefit them, that they will get higher salaries, that they will be able to occupy higher positions within hierarchies or establish particular kinds of companies or whatever. And this is very often associated with a particular kind of lifestyle as well. So, you know, the idea that you'll be able to occupy the first class lounges in airports and jump on and off planes a lot, you know, that kind of thing. So there's a particular sort of idea of the individual that's being sold, in contrast, I think, to the more traditional notions of liberal education as being something which is a kind of, if you like, a more collective good or a form of cultivation of the self, which isn't directly related to economic or personal advancement. The business school curriculum, this is the slide that annoys most of the business school academics I know. I think the business school curriculum can effectively be reduced to 3 key points. One is the dominance of the corporation. So the corporation is usually regarded to be the ultimate form of organising. Other forms of organising are available, but they're basically immature forms of corporation. So the corporation is what all organisations aspire to be, and it's the form of organising which all organisations need to be measured by, because it is the most putatively the most effective at producing large scale change, at innovation, at generating shareholder value, etc., etc. The shareholder value question, of course, effectively means that that's the form of value which is celebrated within business schools, not other forms of value, of social value or personal value or political value or ethical value or whatever they might be, but shareholder value. There's a kind of condensation there, so that the value of a form of organising, a corporation, effectively becomes shareholder value. Now that's very much tied to my second point, which is really about growth, of direct concern to your lab, because business schools generally teach that growth is always good, that expanding, that the having graphs that go up as you go further right is just generally a good thing, whether it's in terms of the the number of employees or products or countries or whatever it might be, normally piles of cash. That growing is simply a good thing, and there is no question, very little, almost no consideration of the idea of say what Schumacher called steady state economics, and almost no consideration, almost no consideration at all of any of those degrowth ideas. And then finally, management, that the technology that achieves all this is a form of hierarchical organization in which one particular category of people, managers, occupy the apex of any form of organization, and they practice a thing called management, which allows them to see the world in different ways than ordinary employees. The hidden claim there is that most people aren't capable of managing themselves, that we are insufficient, that the vast majority of people need to be led, if you like. So hierarchy effectively becomes kind of naturalized. The assumption is that we need hierarchical organizations in order to produce corporations that grow. Yeah, and so these three assumptions are kind of in lockstep, if you like. They form a kind of a bedrock to 95% of the curriculum in 95% of the business schools in 95% of the world. So who's it for? Who's this education for? Well, I think it's fairly clear that it's for those who benefit from or want to benefit from the standard model of global capitalism. Effectively, that means that what business schools are doing is teaching how to do capitalism. So they're teaching how to produce, and I'm just going to flick through these very quickly because I'm sure none of this stuff will surprise you. They're teaching how to produce gigantic, staggering now levels of inequality, forms of inequality that I don't think we've really seen since the pharaohs, which really almost dwarf the sort of robber baron stuff that I was talking about 5 minutes ago. Forms of capitalism that reproduce a set of hegemonic relations which dominate particular kinds of markets. This is a fairly old graph of food corporations and the brands that they own, but we can draw an infographic like this for virtually every market segment globally, and see that there are a small number of organizations that basically own everything else, pretty much what Marx predicted. Also produces a whole series of externalities, whether in terms of unemployment or pain or suffering or migration or whatever it might be, or as in this slide, externalities. Excuse me if I blow my nose, I have a slight cold. I'll be with you in a moment. That's better. I'm sure you really wanted to hear and see that. And then finally, capitalism also is entirely complicit with climate change. It's businesses that produce carbon. So if we want to address these kinds of questions, then we need to directly face the issue that we need to change business. Now, I think that means that effectively what business schools are doing is not so much education as a form of ideological reproduction. They are reproducing a set of ideas that benefit a particular economic system, and most pertinently, really, that benefit a relatively small number of inhabitants of the global north. So these are forms of ideological reproduction. And it's here where we get onto the critique. So, this is what I was prefiguring at the start of the talk, really, that it's not as if there haven't been lots of people who've been critical of this stuff. I mentioned critical management studies at the start. Critical management studies has been, noisy and active for the last 30 years in the global north. It has some purchase in North America and other parts of the world, and has produced piles and piles of books and journal articles and all the rest of it. It's not as if the evidence base is lacking, if you like. And many of these ideas from critical management studies have been drawing across a rich range of alternative perspectives that are routinely employed in other social science and humanities disciplines: feminist, anarchist, green, post-colonial, socialist, queer, and so on. Yeah, there's lots of examples of the ways in which these forms of critique have been used. In addition to that, there's a whole series of alternatives which, if you like, are kind of softer and more acceptable forms of alternative. So, very often we would talk about teaching corporate social responsibility, ideas about diversity, sustainability, and ethics, and so on. Even now in many universities in the global north, teaching about decolonizing the curriculum and all the rest of it. But none of these are providing a workable alternative way of thinking about how we organize. Effectively, they add up to a kind of a war of the pen. Academics like me and my friends producing more and more unread journal articles that they might be discussing with their students and with each other, but make very little actual difference to the way that global capitalism is structured. So sadly, it seems to me that even though we might say that much of this work over the last 30 years has been helpful in providing a set of ideas, it hasn't been particularly helpful in terms of translating into practices. So it seems to me, and this is kind of going back to the popular cultural point really, that if we want to understand what to do, what strategies to employ to think about how we change, we need to turn back to questions of how we engage in political activity in other contexts, because the forms of political activity which seem to take place within universities and business schools are not terribly effective. So, like many of you, I engage in a variety of these forms of activity: attending demonstrations, joining political parties and social movements, trying to buy from social enterprise, boycotting various other companies. This whole kind of a set of activities, if you like, that engage me in various forms of ethical consumption and investment, and so on. Now, these forms of activity are basically ways of thinking about connections between activism and organising in a much more general sense than the specific forms of organising that usually get talked about within the business school. And this is a crucial distinction for my argument, and one that I've been kind of pushing for a couple of decades now, really, that organising is not the same as management. What is taught in business schools is management. It's a particular form of hierarchical activity, usually associated with large organizations and very often entirely complicit with particular notions about gender and ethnicity and education and all the rest of it. Organising, I think, is a much more helpful concept than that. Organising is a way of referring to how people and things come together. And organising varies historically, spatially, nationally, ethnically. As I said, my first degree was in anthropology, which is, a study of different ways that human beings have organised in terms of thinking about different kinship systems or ideas about inheritance or ideas about sexuality or whatever it might be. What anthropologists can document is a huge variety of forms of organising, not just one, not just management as the solution to all human problems. Organising, I'm defining here very generally as the object of inquiry of that part of the university which is concerned with exchange and organisations. That seems to me a sufficiently general account of what we should be up to. And this sits very awkwardly with contemporary ideas about the business school, because the business school is based on gigantic exclusions. What would we think of a history department that only taught about the 15th and 19th centuries? Or of a geography department that only talked about South America and Australia, or a medical school that only taught about certain parts of the body? Because effectively what we have is a business school that only teaches about certain forms of organisation, that only does research on certain forms of organisation. It's as if the other organisational forms don't exist. This is a bit like that sort of idea from the 1960s, 60s and 70s that sociologists of education were pushing, the idea of the hidden curriculum. This was very often focused on questions of gender and then slightly later on questions of ethnicity. But it was effectively suggesting that what doesn't get taught is as important as what does. So if young girls are taught that the only people who end up as scientists or composers or politicians are men, then the message that's being given is that women can't do this kind of stuff. So the hidden curriculum is that they don't matter, that women aren't important. Effectively, the hidden curriculum of the business school, I think, is alternative economic practices. So this is, a set of actually existing alternative economic practices, perhaps ones that many of you might be studying, might be interested in, might practice yourselves. These are forms of economic practice that are not taught generally within business schools. Not taught in 95% of the business schools, 95% of the time. Now that's the hidden curriculum then, isn't it? That's the stuff that effectively is being delegitimized. It's being suggested it doesn't matter, that it's not important. Now it's here that we get on to, I think, some of the sort of questions that might preoccupy us in the questions here, because I think it requires that we sort of restart our assumptions about what we're looking for when we're studying organising. And the bit of inspiration I want to use here is from the study of the natural world. So this is a bit of the preface from the Royal Horticultural Society's Gardener's Encyclopedia of Plants and Flowers. And it basically says there are lots of different plants and flowers. Yeah. And when you read the book, it's a gigantic, beautiful encyclopedia full of pictures of different sorts of plants and flowers. And it tells you about huge plants and flowers and tiny plants and flowers that can live in very salty places or very dry places or very hot places, even in extremely inhospitable climates, next to vents belching sulfurous fumes and all the rest of it. Plants that can live for countless millennia, and plants that can grow underground without light, and plants that can gradually move to different places, and plants that have different reproduction strategies, and all the rest of it. So the kind of epistemological assumption that's been made when you study botany and zoology is about variety. Yeah. There might be an underlying principle of evolution, of course, here, but in general, what you're looking at is the manifestation of diversity, not the idea that you're looking for one thing, that you're looking for finer and finer gradations of management, for example. Now, these sorts of ideas about diversity seem to me really important if we're going to understand the sorts of organisation theory that we're going to need in future. Because it seems to me that we need to get away from this sort of tired recitation that there are certain organizational forms and strategies that are required in order to make business and management successful, and instead study variety, difference, diversity, and so on. I'm particularly keen on this phrase experimentalism. I don't know if that echoes with people. But the idea of an experimental science is surely one that tries to understand the conditions of possibility for doing things differently, and to see whether particular kinds of experiments work in different sorts of contexts. I assume that the underlying assumption of any science which is based, any study which is based on variety, pluralism, and so on, is to be looking at what works when. Yeah, what happens if we do this in this particular kind of context with these kinds of people? Yeah, so it's a kind of a catalogue of diversity, if you like. A couple of years ago, quite a few years ago, this was in 2007. Now, God, I'm getting old. I, together with some other friends, edited this dictionary of alternatives. And this was based on the idea that we could produce a kind of gigantic compendium of ideas about organisation, And in this book would be actually existing economic alternatives like, you know, co-ops and mutuals and things like that, different ways of thinking about ownership and control. But there would also be utopias of different kinds that thought about different modes of organization across time and space, terrorist groups, organized criminals, ideas about different forms of work organization, and so on. What we wanted to do was have kind of a rich compendium of different ideas about organizing. And the book that we eventually produced was 250,000 words long. It was a huge rambling book which had a whole series of things in it. And we took it to the publishers, Z Books in London, and they said we can't publish it because it's too big. There's too much here. And so we had to agree to cut the book down to 120,000 words in order that it could be a publishable book. I kind of like that story in terms of the idea that as soon as you start to think about organizing, there's a kind of an excess. It runs everywhere, you know, nothing is off the table, if you like. But this was the contents for the cut down dictionary, and there's an awful lot of stuff still in here, obviously. And one of the entries, if you can see it, about halfway up on the right hand side, is management. Because we're not denying, I'm not denying that management is a form of organization. I'm just saying it's one form of organization amongst many, many, many others. Drawing to some kind of conclusion, my idea about a school for organizing, and this is where we get to the sort of the heart of the connection really with your lab, is the idea of studying what it means to produce a low carbon economy. And the School for Organising would have no particular assumptions about what the best forms of organisation were in order to reach that low carbon economy. But it would, if you like, experiment with a whole series of potential solutions in different places and different times. So there's no kind of prior assumptions in the way that there always are within the business school about the best shape and size, about the best ways to think about exchange, or the best ways to think about decision making, or the best ways to think about responsibility. All of these are, if you like, regarded as variables. For those of you who have been trained in organization theory, it's like a kind of radical form of contingency theory, if you like, in which every variable that we could use to describe an organization is contingent. And we don't assume that we know the best shape, the best answer to those variables in advance of studying them in particular places and particular times. Now, the kind of politics of this, and I'm almost at the end now, is really important, but sort of buried in many of the arguments I'm making, because essentially what I want to be saying is that organising is a form of politics made durable. That's to say that when we organise, what we do is to embed into ideas about responsibility and reward and time and space political ideas about human beings and their relations with each other. So effectively, what the School for Organising is trying to do is think about different political configurations to imagine different ways in which people might be put into relation with another in order to produce goods and services which are of common benefit without damaging our common home. Now, that's a political activity. So the School for Organising is, of course, necessarily political. But in doing that, I think I would argue that the university then gets a proper discipline and not merely a finishing school for capitalism. Thank you very much. That is that. I'll stop sharing. Okay, was that all right? Can't hear anyone. Thank you, Ben. nice clappy thing. Can't hear anyone, Mario.
Hear me, Martin?
Can now, yeah.
Hi, sorry, Mario's just answering a phone call.
Okay.
It will be 1 minute, I think.
No problem. Well, should we just start without him?
Oh. Yeah.
Okay.
We don't. I've just been telling you we don't need leaders and bosses, all right? So let's just get on with it. Yeah.
So this is what
could you lock him out of the room so he can't get back in?
this is exactly what I'm trying to say and communicate to them since they joined the group. But it seems that people still need to be told what to do. You know, this is something.
That's
Okay, so
exactly what a hierarchical and authoritarian leader would say, Mario.
Yeah. Okay, so I think it was a very inspiring presentation. So I don't know, I want to open the debate. Pretty sure that people here, PhD and postdoctoral students, have a question. Or
please do, yeah. And apologies for my endless sniffing as well and blowing my nose. Sorry about this.
Okay, so we have Javier, Ben, and Sofia. Sorry.
Hey, Ben.
Okay, should I go first or Mario? Yeah. Okay. I don't know if whether you can see me here, Mario.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's Javier. So thanks very much for your talk. It was really interesting, and coming from a business school myself, I can definitely relate to many of the stuff, or most of the stuff you were saying. To me, one of the big barriers is precisely the tuition fee. And I think because the sort of a school of organizing in the conventional mindset will place us immediately in the humanities camp. Like these people that do things for the sake of it. Mm. And so I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm saying like this is probably the way this is perceived. And I'm telling you that because I used to teach, I used to bring in my lectures some radical stuff. Like I talked to them about degrowth. I was teaching marketing, right? And I had no problem teaching to them about degrowth or all these. I don't know. Like I talked to them about quite like alternative ways of organizing, etc. And students love it. But then like you get to the question of like, so what? What do we do with this? How can we get a job? By learning about this and how, so you always end up in this discussion that is not particularly helpful anyway, but the discussion is there. So my question to you is like, how do you think, or what do you think will be the way to deal with that, to deal with these concerns that are real and the students have them, if we had to put in place this school of organizing? Yeah. So how could we overcome this? Not sure if the question is clear enough.
Yeah, it is. It's a really difficult question. I agree. I mean, I think when I was writing the book, I'd been kind of putting the question off, and then in chapter 9, I sort of asked the question, what do students want? How can we sell this to students? But one of the things that I think I end up very often doing is kind of reversing the question in a way. Because my sense is, that the undergraduates and postgraduates that I teach fully understand that capitalism causes climate crisis. They understand the gigantic inequalities that exist within and between nations. They walk over people sleeping in the street on the way to lecture theatres, and they've had an education which has been teaching them about the last polar bear dying on the last iceberg ever since they were toddlers, ever since they were kids. So they know that there's a problem. What they don't know is what they can do about it. What kind of efficacy they have, what agency they have in this. So I think the responsibility of the School for Organising is to teach them about their agency, to explain to them that they are not simply confronted by the gigantic oppositional forces of a form of capitalism that's impossible to move, but rather that it is possible to think about alternative forms of business. Because I'm not hostile to ideas about business. We are going to exchange things and make things and share things and all the rest of it. But it's possible to develop forms of business that do not have the same kinds of damaging effects. So effectively, I think we should be, rather than simply critiquing the existent, we should be presenting them with the tools that allow them to see that they can do stuff. And once you do that, then many of them are pretty positive. They're not in my experience, I don't know in Spain, but in the UK, even those students who are quite committed to a kind of, if you like, a corporate career, understand the limitations of this stuff. I was doing a talk like this to our student management society, a couple of weeks ago. And it started off quite badly because I was imagining that, many of them were talking about how they were going to get jobs in consultancies and all the rest of it later. But as they began to trust me and were talking to me about stuff, they got it. They understand this stuff. As I keep saying, they just don't know what to do about it. They can't see their way through to solutions. So we need to help them with that, right? We've got the tools, so let's sell them the idea of a different way of thinking about the global economy. Does that help? You look skeptical. You're on mute.
I just wonder, no. Okay, sorry. Thanks. No, I agree with everything you said. I was also teaching in the UK context myself, okay. And so to me I agree with you. Like, the students get it and they sympathize, and there is something which many of them are immediately connect with the contents because they see the relevance of it. To me, is the problem of tuition fees.
Yeah, that's what you started. Sorry, yes, I didn't address
the tuition fees issue that I think, I think we cannot avoid that, because a school of organizing in the current, neoliberal academia is never going to work, because students have to pay these high tuition fees. They're expecting to get a job at the end of their courses, even if they agree with us fully.
I think you're right, and I mean, as soon as we start to explore those sorts of ideas, then the critique of the business school necessarily becomes a critique of the modern university, of particular ways of thinking about knowledge and its enclosure, and then how we sell knowledge to particular people at particular times and spaces. So yes, ultimately you're right. In the UK now, it's very difficult to imagine rolling back on tuition fees. There would be very little political sympathy, I think, amongst any of the political parties for abolishing tuition fees. There were moves in terms of the Corbyn Labour Party in terms of dialing them back, but even that might have been politically impossible because there's too much money at stake, essentially. I'm not sure what the situation is in Spain. My guess is that it's a combination of a combination of some state-supported and some private universities, something along those lines, I would guess. But yes, it certainly skews students' choices. If, as in the UK, they're going to end up with, £50,000, whatever, €60,000 of debt before they graduate, and that means they make different kinds of choices. I agree.
Okay, in Spain it works that there is no like a business school, public business school. There are private schools that are extremely expensive, expensive, even like more expensive than the UK. Okay, so we have Ben, Sophia, and then Alex. I think that Joe was commenting on the chat saying that the tuition fees is not only a problem of business school in the UK.
Yeah, it's thanks, Joe. It's England rather than Scotland. I know.
Ben.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Martin. Very interesting. I think I agree with a lot of stuff. I think I have a more critical view on business itself, which I think would equate to your definition of corporation. So I see businesses inherently as capitalist. But my question is more on, of course, the focus on this business school, right? And we can say, okay, it reproduces capitalism and teaches us how to teach capitalism. In my own experience, I started as a bachelor student in a private business school in Germany, got my BA, and then moved on after work in London, of course, moved on to Leeds, and then did a master's in ecological economics, not in a business school, but in the School of Earth and Environment. And my question here is, of course, it's not only the business school that reproduces capitalism in this toxic environment. Even the School of Earth and Environment did it. Like, yes, we had some ecological economists and you could say certain things, but when it came down to sustainability in business, and even though the people weren't in the business school, these people basically reproduced CSR, etc., and so forth. And if you really wanted something critical on organizing or economic organizations, you had to basically deduct this down from the macroeconomics of ecological economics. So what would you say that maybe it's not just a question of like having a new business school or school for organizing, which I love, but maybe actually that it's a bigger problem. We have to change like the education system overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's a real danger, I think, that I'm read as sort of suggesting that if we change business schools, we'll change the world. Yeah, and I'm not that naive. Business schools are my problem because I work in one, and so I focus on changing those. But it's absolutely the case that those kinds of naturalized assumptions about the ways that economies work, the way that people are motivated, the need for hierarchy and management and so on, are very, very often ideas which are naturalized in lots of other disciplines. It's kind of always interested me, particularly, as I kind of feel I come from outside the business school, that very often when you talk to people in the humanities, social sciences and sciences, they kind of assume that a managerial form of organization is the norm, and that's the best way to do things. I remember when I was, I think I was head of department at Keele University in England, and getting an email from, I think he was like he was in charge of like biology or chemistry or something like that, and he was asking me for advice on the best way to reorganize the department, on the assumption that I would know, the best forms of hierarchical structure and information and decision making and all the rest of it. And I can't remember what I sent back, but I just remember thinking, Jesus, he is as conservative. This is someone who's probably never studied management, but obviously had some very conservative ideas about, conservative with a small c, ideas about the way that his lab should be organized. So yeah, sure, we need to change this stuff. I guess just going back to the first way that I answered that, at the moment, I want to concentrate on changing the business school because, as I've said, that's such a crucial and large area of knowledge production globally. And if those UNESCO figures are right, 1 in 5, 1 in 4 students studying this stuff, then that's a gigantic ideological transmission belt, isn't it? So if that can be interfered with in some way, I think I'd be doing something reasonably worthwhile. Yeah.
Sophia? Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, Sophia, yes.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk, which I found really interesting, particularly because my friend is an administrator at the London Business School. So I'm looking forward to discussing with her. I come to this project from a PhD in urban planning in the 19th century, which studied how ideal city schemes were implemented as a way to civilize, reorganize, and capitalize cities.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And in the colonies. And for this reason, I was really interested to see some of that literature in your big list of alternatives.
Yeah.
Like the Port Sunlight and William Morris's News from Nowhere.
Yeah.
So I have a sort of a comment and also a question. I wondered if you taught with or would consider teaching urban planning within business studies because it's so key to economic organization, and also whether you had come across similar examples of utopian literature or ideal cities now which offer different spatial forms of economic organization.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting question. It's a nice example of the ways that knowledge can fold into other disciplines as well, isn't it? Because it seems to me that it's almost inconceivable now that we could talk about low carbon business without talking about the low carbon city, for example. And that means thinking about where people work and where people live in, very crude terms. One of the things that COVID has encouraged an awful lot of thinking about clearly is location and how we do this kind of stuff. I was having an interesting conversation, was it yesterday, with somebody, and we were talking about bikes. I was in Oxford yesterday, so university town and all the rest of it, and we were talking about bikes and cars and low traffic neighborhoods and various other things like that. And there's so many interesting things at stake there, but one of the central ones is the presumption that people live and work in different places. And that produces, you know, gigantic conflict, say in the area of Oxford that I was in, between those people who are enthusiastic about the idea of basically zero traffic neighborhoods and those people who absolutely require some kind of car in order to drop their kids off and then go to work and, you know, imagine holidays and all the rest of it. So, you know, there's some very material considerations in this, I think. I assume, and this isn't, you know, I'm sure you know a hell of a lot more about this than me, that much of the urban planning literature is rotates around these kinds of questions, like that guy, is it Moreno, the 15-minute city? You know, that idea that we almost need to decompose the city into smaller units in which you could imagine. Is the 15 minutes is the idea that you should be able to walk to everything that you need within 15 minutes. I think that's the presumption, isn't it? Yes, you were nodding. Okay, yeah. So that sort of idea. So then we get into some kind of much more complex relationship between work and space, I suppose. Work and residence and space. Because I assume that simply saying everyone's going to work at home really, you know, isn't going to be okay. You can't have, you know, people aren't going to be, bakers aren't going to be working at home. You know, that's not really going to happen. So there will be distinctions, but how we build cities around those is a very long and tricky question. And there's lots more I could say about that, but I won't because I suspect you already know it anyway.
Do you want to reply back? You want to reply back? Comment?
No, I not yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think there is Alex and Joe. Alex.
Hey, Alex.
Hi, Martin. Thank you
Hi.
so much for your presentation.
Pleasure.
I will try to make my questions, but I'm pretty sick today. I'm way worse than usual. I'm gonna do my best to ask the questions that I would like to ask you. So, yeah, I studied business management, not in a business school, but in a university in Spain. But even if you don't have tuition fees, even if you don't have like all these kinds of entries that make the entry kind of difficult for everyone, you still reproduce what you were describing on your book, like the ideology, the fact that there are non-alternatives to this kind of standardized business. So I was so happy to read your books because it really made me feel better about a lot of things that I have thought during 5 years.
Good.
Yeah.
Don't make my books depress people. I'm glad they're making you happier, Alex.
Well, today I don't look that I look white, but I was happy. and yeah, that was the first thing. So then I had two questions. So yeah, the first is like, what should be organizing from your point of view?
Missed you.
The second one is where.
Alex, just do the first question again because you froze for a second and I lost it.
Yeah, sorry. So my first question was, what should be the role of the School of Organizing that you describe in your book? And the second one is where and who should learn organizing?
Yes, both great questions. So the School for Organising, and you know, bear in mind that this is, if you like, a kind of a thought experiment in a way. It's sort of, you know, what would a department in a university that really took organising seriously teach about? Yeah, and so one of the ways of thinking about this is as a department that adopts an open view of organising and consequently teaches about all sorts of forms of organising in all sorts of ways. So I was imagined that you would have courses on organised crime and courses on the hierarchies of angels and on co-ops and on the kinship systems of the Nuer in sub-Saharan Africa, whatever it might be. You know, lots of different ways of thinking about organising. And the assumption would be that this would be a bit like a kind of, I suppose, something like a design school or something almost, you know, that you're saying you could do it like this, or you could do it like this, and do it like that, without any necessary assumption about these things being the best or the worst ways to do things, but to stimulate people's imaginations to the idea that they could organize differently too. Yeah. I assume when you go to art school, the idea isn't just to, you know, do Picasso. It's like, you know, it's to do something different yourself. That's the idea. So I guess that's what I imagine the School of Organising might be. However, the more radical versions of this would have to take it outside the university, and that's the implication of your second question, I think, because you know, and I'm very clear about this, that any incorporation within the university context will necessarily restrict the possibilities for thinking about really radical organizational forms, and consequently, and it's here that, you know, the writings of people like Illich and McLaren and Freire kind of become relevant in that sense of deschooling education, based on the idea that organizing is something that everybody should be able to do, yeah, not something which you simply go to certain kinds of places and get taught about. And I quite like this idea, and I need to explore it a bit more, that in medieval English, the word managing or managery was very often used as something like the word coping. Yeah, so you would have managery as a kind of a practical skill. If you had a complex task to perform, then you would require managery to deal with it. Now that's not a technical skill. It's a capacity that human beings have, and you can have more or less of it. So in a sense, I guess the implication of your when and who second question would be to say that, you know, we should all be taught about this kind of stuff. We should all be taught the capacity for taking responsibility to think about organizing rather than letting other people organize us. Was that
Yes.
fair response?
Could I add something?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's like a really deep thought that I had sometimes, right? But sometimes I was asking myself, like, should this be like why should it be like a specific studies, right? Because from my point of view, I don't know, I would like to have learned like different fields, you know, more mixed like kind of studies. And then what you were saying, like, I think everyone should know like some ways of organizing. But for me, organizing itself, I didn't see that it should be a thing itself, because then you are really like, how do you say that? Like limited to it, no? Like you really spend 5 years on it, and then in your head it stays. So you try to legitimize this, maybe, no?
Yeah. I guess, I mean, one of the things behind this sort of idea is my sense, you know, and I'm not the only person to have this, that for many people, they regard the economy as something which they have no control over. The economy, the line I sometimes use is, you know, the economy is a shy but dangerous beast that lives in Tokyo, New York, and London and does things to us, you know. On the news, we're told that the economy is cross about things, or the economy is happy about things. And I think for many people, the economic life in general is something that they feel that they have no choice but to accommodate to, rather than making the weather, in a sense. So I guess I hope that the School for Organising would be a way of ensuring that people, that brings those ideas closer to people in a practical way. Yeah. And what they do with them, I don't know. I mean, maybe the metaphor of the art school is a good one. I haven't thought about this enough, Alex, really. You know, but that idea of kind of I give you the tools, you know, I'm going to teach you how to draw a bit and paint a bit and sculpt a bit and make some pots and stuff like that. But then, you know, now you go and do something. You make something beautiful and come back and show me. You know, it's that sort of idea. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Do you see what I mean? I don't know.
As
is
that's a
obvious
really
from
open question. Yeah.
Okay, as is obvious from my answer, I need to think about this a bit more. I've been talking about the School for Organising for a couple of years now, and hoping that there's someone on a call who's going to be, you know, a friendly multimillionaire who will basically give me, Ben, is it you? Who's going to give me a huge amount of cash. So if any of you know any friendly but guilty millionaires, just let me know. Okay, message me. Joe, I think you're next.
Joe.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I don't know any millionaires, but
Damn. I have no further use for you.
I mean, I really loved your last point. Actually, in this, you know, that like whilst we're in these institutions, organizing in the way within our schools, but also beyond our schools, is essential. But then also, you know, I really like when scholars are open to this idea, whilst we are in these institutions, that at some point maybe there comes a time where these institutions aren't, you know, like, when are these schools becoming redundant? I think organizing, and I think as an activist, like, I know that organizing is something that people do out of necessity, but also out of, you know, not just out of necessity, but I think also out of like community spirit and out of like the want to organize, like, for us. And I think so, like, yeah, I really, really like your point also about like the imaginary. And so I think like my kind of like common question was more about like your, like, how you phrase something as like, not just as, I don't know, I have an issue with the ways of like alternative organizing, because I think it centers kind of like, it like marginalizes actually very common forms of organizing, and something that has been historically and also now is actually very much that like the majority does, rather than, you know, like, so yeah, I kind of like wonder how you phrase these sorts of things, and like how maybe like, or like if you have ideas around, because I really struggle sometimes with terminology around that. And if you have any ideas, and also like kind of like how you can see that like we can kind of like maybe practice some of those ways that you just said around organizing and organizational thought, you know, as now being part of the economics department here, but being in our little research group, how we can like maybe practice some of those things.
Just to start off then, the word alternative, and I do puzzle about that. I mean, at the moment it's quite a useful term because it sort of marks a distinction and makes it clear that I am trying to occupy a particular kind of position. But I also wonder whether that then naturalizes the opposition. It kind of naturalizes the orthodoxy, doesn't it? A sort of centrality of the orthodoxy. I haven't found a neat way through that, Joe, because if I didn't, because I have to talk about my opposition to the existing system, and you know, the danger, particularly from within the business school, is that, and I've done this endlessly, you know, talked to various sort of deans and pro-business, the status quo apologists, in which they say, you know, things like, but we teach about social responsibility and corporate purpose, you know, that because that must be what you're doing then. So in that sense, it's really helpful for me to say, no, I'm not, you know, I'm opposed to all that stuff. And so the word alternative then kind of becomes helpful. But in the longer term, of course, we have to naturalize this stuff. And, you know, according to, you know, global co-ops data and so on, about 1/7 of the world's economy is cooperative, you know, not always particularly democratically controlled, but, you know, nominally cooperatively owned. So, yeah, it's not a minor alternative. I guess the other part of it is, you know, at what point do we stay in or get out or something? I've spent a long time within universities trying to think about ways in which we could radicalize our teaching and research. It's much, much harder to think about how you can radicalize your governance within the university, because universities, I don't know about Spain, but, you know, in the UK, they have very strongly hierarchical structures. So say, for example, I remember at one point we were talking about, when I was at the University of Leicester, talking about the idea of having some sort of team of heads that would be responsible for different things, but no one of them would be dominant. But the university just refused to accept it. You know, it wasn't, no, we want one person to talk to, you know. No, it depends what you're talking about, you know, which we thought it was the thoroughly sensible idea, that we distribute leadership between, you know, a group of people, and those people could in turn be responsible to a larger committee of people and so on. But no, the university wanted one head, you know, that's the idea, and that one head had to have, you know, certain sorts of exclusive knowledge about certain sorts of things and all the rest of it, you know, that kind of stuff. So it's very hard to do it within. But as soon as you start to think about exodus, about moving out, then you're sort of moving out of a culturally and economically valuable position, and need to be very clear about what that involves. One of my favorite sort of ways of thinking about this is an ex-colleague called Stefano Hani. And Stefano's written a nice sort of series of musings with Fred Moten on the business school, on the university more generally, really, and has this idea about the undercommons, sort of, so how you steal stuff from the institution, you know, how you both for yourselves and your colleagues, work within the institution, all these sort of metaphors of being a mole, being underground, moving things around and stuff. But also one thing that particularly interests me is how do you use the times and spaces of the university to connect to activists in your city, in your region. So a lot of the work that I'm involved in now with this inclusive economy initiative is trying to take the university's resources and status and credibility and all the rest of it, and then connect that with much smaller and more vulnerable groups in productive ways. Yeah, and using lots of metaphors about, you know, co-production and engagement and all that kind of stuff. So at the moment, I guess I'm not ready to leave the university. I think it would be politically foolish to do that. I think that the university, however tentatively, can become slightly more useful for radicals like us. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have Alisa here.
I'm just a bit more curious about you. Sorry, do you hear me?
Just about. Shout, Alyssa.
Yeah, okay. I'm just a bit more curious about your teaching practice and so on, and what your experiences are there, and more specifically about like fostering, I don't know, more alternative, I don't know, maybe very Foucauldian terminology, like subjectivities. I was in the geography department in Oxford, which has a fair amount of critical thought and so on. And I don't know if you know Danny Dorling, but he, last year or 2 years ago, published this thing about how geography is failing because despite all the critical content that is being produced in geography, loads of bachelor students end up going into the city and doing horrible things. And so I'm just curious about like, if you have managed to foster like that kind of, like early on you were saying like the agency of people to produce different kinds of economic realities within the business. I'm assuming that the people who are attracted to business school might be more, I don't know, I'm not making any assumptions maybe, but like just that it's
yes, you are.
kind of maybe a harder group. But I don't know, like I'm just curious if you've managed to like produce something different in at least some students on and if there's any other kind of resistances on a deeper level other than the tuition fees, and how you've encountered and dealt with that, basically.
Yeah. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that that's up to the students to answer the question, really, rather than me. I might have all sorts of ideas about the effectiveness of my teaching that are no more than the delusions of an old man. So, you know, really, you'd have to ask the students. My sense is that I have had some effect, but there's kind of two things that are worth saying there. Bear in mind that most of my teaching is on quite specific modules, very often optional modules that people have picked. So, for example, I teach a lot on business ethics courses. And I've always used business ethics as a way of then kind of moving to a condensation between ethics and politics, and then talking about how do we judge existing economic systems. So I kind of build the narrative, if you like, as a move from ideas about the single ethical decision maker to thinking about the ethics of a particular economic system. Yeah. But that's an illustration of a particular way of thinking about teaching, isn't it? Because I don't think it's very helpful for me to march into classrooms and say, I'm an anti-capitalist Marxist who supports Extinction Rebellion. Yeah, I don't think that's a very useful way to start. So very often I will start quite gently, trying to, be with the students where they are, and then trying to gradually and quite sneakily in some ways talk about parts of their practical experience in order to move them to the kind of positions I want them to occupy. But quite often that's really no more than pointing to their everyday experience. If you want to talk about, let's say, climate change, for example, that's such an easy way in now to thinking about, why is climate change happening? What are the forms of organising that are producing climate change? Consequently, what other forms of organising might not produce climate change? So there's an easy way to move I'm not saying anything spectacular there. I'm just saying that teachers need to start with where the students are. Yeah, you can't walk in and start banging your drum, because that's not going to work. But you know, if you show some sympathy and understanding with what you think are their experiences, then you can usually start to move them slowly towards your understanding of the world. I think that's no more than describing what any halfway decent teacher would be doing. That sounded like rather a wet answer. I feel I should have said something more radical.
Do you want to comment back? No. Does anybody have a question? I don't know if Alejandro, your hand is raised. I don't know if no. So maybe I have a last question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Mario.
No, thank you very much for all the conversation and interesting insights and ideas. And of course, I invite you to spend some time here in Pontevedra in spring or in summer. We have fantastical seafood, or if you are vegan or vegetarian, white wine is great in Galicia. So this is a formal invitation. Richard Owen will be here as well. So maybe we can have we can be together. My question is about.
I think Alejandro had a problem with the oysters, obviously.
Yes. Well, that's
probably why he's in bed.
Not my oysters, anyway. So my question is about technology, because one of the focus of Prospera is this idea of innovation has been co-opted and actually was almost, I would say, invented within the context and framework of capitalism. And one of the focus of Prospera is looking at forms of organization that are dealing with technology in a different way. So my question, it's a very general question, so I just want you to give some general thought about it. What is, in your opinion, the relation between technology and the kind of technology that an alternative organization can deliver? And if you think that there is like a substantial difference between the way of organizing and the kind of technological outcome that the specific organization or specific way of organizing can deliver.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. There's lots of kind of sub questions in that, aren't there? One of the assumptions I would make, Mario, and probably one that I guess you'd agree with, is that technology is not in itself determinant. That technology offers multiple affordances, and we can do different things with the same techne, if you like, can produce different kinds of results for us. The other thing that I think it's worth saying is that it seems to me that sometimes it's very helpful to use some of that innovation type language, but to radicalize it in some ways. So at the moment, I sit on a sort of group which called Bristol Innovations, which is looking at how the university produces various forms of kind of spin-out business, if you like. And much of that stuff is focused very much on STEM disciplines and on essentially digital stuff, and how it produces a certain value through IP, licensing, whatever it might be for the university. Now, I'm not interested in those things particularly, but I am very interested in the language that they use in order to talk about how the university breaks down boundaries between itself and other organizations. So there's a whole series of concepts, and I know you know about this stuff around, slingshots and catapults and innovation systems and ecosystems and all the rest of it, which I think actually might be quite useful if it's stripped away from its kind of STEM, science and technology, science, technology and medicine capitalism. Because one of the difficulties I think we very often have within universities is a question of boundaries and how we reach across those boundaries to do something useful with other organizations. Now, that kind of means that some of the technology projects I'm involved in, and I'll just describe one, could actually be radicalized by thinking about those boundaries in different sorts of ways. So one of them, I'm involved in quite a lot of these sorts of things across the city and region now in Bristol. One of them is the City Council's volunteering platform called Can Do. So Bristol City Council licenses a very interesting piece of software called Can Do, and has been branded as Can Do Bristol. It's now got about 10,000 people on it who are volunteering in various ways across the city for mostly third sector organisations. And it got a big kick from COVID because lots of people were, trying to volunteer to help their neighbours and work at food banks and various other things like that. Now, at the moment, I mean, the basis of that technology, I think, is free labour, and it's really, really interesting. But one of the things you can see from the data is that it tends to be concentrated in the whiter and wealthier areas of the city. So, as you know, Mario, in the north and the west, basically, that's the concentration of volunteering. So the problem with that one isn't so much the technology as such, because I think I'd met the developer. I think they're really interesting and good, and I like what they're trying to do. It's more, how do you scale these ideas out to other parts of the city, which are less advantaged, shall we say? Yeah, in order that, because very often, as Mario will know, Bristol is very much a city of two halves. There's one half which is, white and affluent and where the university is and all the rest of it, and another half which is much more Brexity and more diverse and more economically troubled. So really, for any form of technology to operate at citywide level, it needs to operate across both sides of that divide. Yeah. So for me, and maybe I would say this as a sociologist, the problem isn't the technology as such, it's kind of the way that the technology is configured, designed, imagined. Because at the moment, that's basically wealthy white people volunteering for each other, and that's fine. I'm not saying they shouldn't be doing that, but it could be doing a lot more. Did that help as a sort of an answer?
Yes, I think it's, and I think what you say is confirmed what me and Richard Owen have found in Bristol, like working on responsible innovation practices.
Okay.
Now the fact that who is going to attend this public engagement and co-production and co-creation workshop? Always the same people, middle-aged white men, people, retired.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Is that, and that in a sense that technology can't compensate for or solve the problems of the social. And so if you've got forms of social exclusion which are embedded, spatially, ethnically, in gender terms, all the rest of it, then technology is not simply going to be, you can't put technology on top and expect it to solve those problems. You've got to work within those problems in order to think about how the technology can reach across boundaries, in a sense. And my particular interest, I suppose, at the moment is, how can the university help with that stuff? And that means the university thinking about its boundaries, about where and when it is, how porous it is, how it engages with other communities that have nothing to do with it normally.
I think Javier wants to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick on that, on this idea that this is a white middle class phenomenon. So I just wanted to ask, from your perspective as an organization of scholars, why do you think this is the case? And I know we could have like another conversation, but I think this is a very important question, and so I would like to hear your views on this. So why do you think that this is actually like a white middle class thing?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer. Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that generally, because I don't know enough about it. But I can answer it specifically in terms of Can Do, and I think there's two issues there. One is that Can Do is hosted by the city council, and the city council is not an organisation that's universally loved. And indeed, in the more deprived areas of the city council is very often seen to be not exactly the enemy, but inept in various ways. Why would you have anything to do with them? They're usually white. they represent some other imagined advantaged part of the city and so on. So I think the very fact that the volunteering function is located in the city council gives it a problem for many people in the city. Secondly, this is not about technological competence, is it? Because many of the people that Can Do would like to be ostensibly reaching out to are technologically skilled in various ways. You know, they've got phones and they can do all sorts of stuff with them. Then they might not be as technologically advantaged as others, but they're not technologically illiterate, the vast majority of them. So if we want to do something about these kinds of questions, then I suspect we need to understand something about almost like the granular detail of particular forms of technology and how they appear to people. Because I'm not sure, and again, I suspect you know much more about this than I do, genuinely, that it won't be possible to come up with sort of general strategies which are going to work for all forms of technology in all places if you want to do responsive innovation. Yeah, it kind of depends where and when you are and who you're dealing with. Which is, again, that's not a very radical thing to say, is it? It's just saying be attentive to context. Yeah, and that seems like a pretty sensible strategy in most contexts, doesn't it?
Okay. Any other question, comments? No, I think we have a lot to think for the future. Martin, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Mario, and thanks everybody for the great questions. And I look forward to eating oysters with you one day.
Yes.
Not with Alessandro though.
We will keep in touch, and I invite our postdoc and PhD, if you want to get in touch with Martin,
yeah, please do. Yeah.
Drop an email. We have several different projects here, PhD projects, and we also have an Edge 2020 on circular economy. So we will be very active in the future.
Yeah. And be really happy to be part of it. It's so important, the work that you're doing. So yeah. You know, anything I can do that would help, just let me know.
Okay. So thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the week.
Thank you very much. You too. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.